So Outlast 2 was released on Tuesday, and much like the first game, I walked away with a general feeling of disappointment mixed with frustration. My experience with the first game left me with a similar impression to the first Assassin's Creed and Watch Dogs games, a semi-decent game with some good ideas that would make a good springboard for a sequel. It was a half fun, half annoying romp through a massive, enjoyably gloomy maze of an asylum, with some interesting and some not so interesting characters, a simple, intriguing story, and an outstanding DLC expansion that was genuinely better than the base game. Where it fell flat was during the second half. The game had no downtime whatsoever. If you weren't being chased by one maniac, then you were being chased by 3 others. It was rare in the last 2 hours of the game that you weren't running away from something, and moving from chase sequence to chase sequence made it extremely difficult to enjoy the game's superb atmosphere and interesting lore. My hope was that Outlast 2 would rectify these mistakes, and when the demo was released a few months ago, I found myself cautiously optimistic. It was good. Scary. I was hyped. And then the game was released. For the first 2 to 3 hours, I enjoyed the hell out of Outlast 2, but as time wore on and the game began to outstay its welcome, I found the old wounds reopening. Some issues I had with the first game have been fixed, but in their place 2 more problems had arisen. The more I played, the more dismayed I became. I didn't hate it, but I didn't particularly like it either. Now, hear me out. According to the game's subreddit, there's been a lot of hate, but I've deliberately stayed away from the forums so that my opinion of the game is entirely based on my experience alone. So without further ado, let's get into what makes this game a solid meh for me. Outlast 2 puts you in the shoes of Blake Langerman, a cameraman travelling to the Deep South with his wife Lynn, following up on reports of a murdered pregnant woman that seems far more sinister in nature than the media would have them believe. En route, their helicopter is down by a strange, unnatural roaring light in the distance. Pilot is killed and Lynn disappears into the ether. Terrified and alone, Blake embarks on a descent into the maddening dark to find his lost wife, uncovering a rampaging, utterly insane cult and their enigmatic preacher along the way. First and foremost, the game looks and runs beautifully. With the settings on high and the frame rate capped at 60, I didn't have a single frame drop nor visual aberration. The game's aesthetic was alarming, starkly contrasting rural simplicity with horrific religious imagery that managed to be subtly monstrous in its normality. As the game progressed and I learnt more about the town and its cultish insanity, what began as an everyday expression of faith and devotion became an insidious window into the mind of madness. Outlast 2, like its predecessor, does a stellar job of subverting what should be perfectly ordinary imagery, combined with the dark, oppressive atmosphere and the frequency with which one spots normality in the distance, only to have it twisted and warped by the time you reach it, lends the game an outstanding atmosphere. Poking around in the various huts and houses is darkly enjoyable, with small details drawn attention to, and giving the game a pleasing sense of authenticity. Having said that, I did come across 2 progression bugs, one reasonably early on and one towards the final hour of the game. Both of these bugs involved the game simply failing to register that a particular action had been performed, preventing a mechanism from stopping and thus blocking access to the route forward. Although restarting from the last checkpoint solved this issue, it was especially frustrating trying to find another switch to turn something off, not knowing that I had already done what needed to be done and the game just hadn't registered that I could now proceed. Thankfully, these 2 instances were the only glitches I encountered, otherwise the game performed pretty well. In keeping with the positive, the game's stealth mechanics are heavily refined. There are plenty of places to hide, and being spotted is no longer the death sentence it tended to be in the first game. The larger open areas are littered with tall grass, dark corners or barrels to hide in. You can also duck underwater to lose your pursuers, a mechanic that I made frantic use of throughout the game. As a result of the tighter mechanics, hiding from enemies is much easier. Provided you're not in direct light, you can lose an enemy simply by sprinting around a corner and diving underwater, and that's often enough just to save your life. However, the game features an insanely frustrating mechanic where an enemy will patrol the general area that you're in, moving from place to place to follow you, even if they have no idea where you are. Very occasionally this allows them to find you even if you don't move and make no noise whatsoever. It can make figuring out where to go bitterly frustrating at times, seeing you dive in and out of cover with reckless abandon as you try to squint through the dark to find the right route. And believe me when I say the game is dark. It is excruciatingly dark. This isn't a problem in and of itself, but it utterly mystifies me that the game removed the record everything element in favour of a record specific events mechanic. presumably to encourage the player not to spend the whole game looking through the camera lens. But they then made the game so miserably dark that you have to spend the whole game staring through the lens because you need the night vision. You spend far too much time worrying about batteries, persistently distracted by the battery icon in the top right corner, and so ignoring a lot of what goes on in front of you. Much like the first game, there is a lot of trial and error gameplay. This was a problem in the original, but Outlast 2 takes this mechanic to its absolute breaking point. There are times when it's extremely difficult to figure out where to turn due to the overwhelming darkness, causing a senseless death as you pivot in circles in a desperate attempt to find the exit. For the most part, the paths are linear, but in the latter half of the game especially, there are much grander open areas that can be a pain to navigate. Because it's so difficult to just stop and take stock of your surroundings so that you can figure out where to go, the game just turns into a bit of a mess of running about from corner to corner in stiflingly awkward level design, just trying to find the way out. And the game is relentless. It bombards the player with scares, especially after about the midway point, over and over and over, ultimately destroying what little tension and atmosphere it had managed to build up to begin with. Just like the original, there is less and less downtime as the game goes on, and just like the original, this means it turns from a really good suspenseful horror game into a frustrating game of cat and mouse. Persistently reminding the player that they are in a horror game really just defeats the purpose of it being a horror game. You can't scare people by just lobbing enemies and silly situations at them. To begin with, the game made good use of its environments to build tension and suspense. But of course this all crumbled as the game threw chase after chase after chase at me. At times it was easier to just bomb through an area without even trying to be stealthy because there was just no point. I knew there'd be a chase eventually, so triggering it early made it a lot less irritating. One of the standout aspects of the first game was its characters. Not so much its main character, I mean no one was going to accuse Miles of having a personality, but the way that it built up the Wall Rider, its serial killers, the priest, and particularly Dr. Wernicke, afforded each of them a genuinely frightening air when you finally met them. The Wall Rider dicked about so much without actually attacking you, and you learnt so much about him in the meantime that when he did finally start chasing you, it was genuinely panic-inducing. Wernicke was given so much attention in the game's lore and spoken about so highly that when you did finally meet him, it was quite clear that this was an extraordinarily powerful, revered man, despite his deceptive appearance. Sadly, the sequel's villains are given no time to develop at all. The priest, the leader of this cult, Noth, is particularly egregious. Being the game's, I suppose, main villain, although it's a little bit difficult to tell, he receives laughably little screen time, appearing in person only twice throughout the whole game. It's unfortunate because what little we do learn about him gives the potential for an interesting character, but it never leads anywhere, and that is a true shame. Now I'm going to apologise for what I'm about to say because I'm sure it will annoy some people, but please bear with me and hear me out. I found the game's story to be utter nonsense. Now, naturally, I don't wish to spoil, but whilst I consider many of the game's events to simply be rather silly instead of frightening or panic-inducing, I will concede that my disdain for the story at least partially comes down to the fact that the game's two core segments, the real world of the cult and a dreamlike realm, I suppose, that contains Blake's memories of a traumatising event many years past, were poorly intertwined. Only by piecing together the incredibly subtle hints that the game gives you and ensuring that you find absolutely every possible note that it provides you, will you begin to make sense of the story. Perhaps I simply missed something that was tremendously important, but I found its story just nonsensical at best. I appreciate what they were trying to do, but with its many ungainly twists and turns and a thorough head-scratcher of an ending, I personally found it just more bewildering than intriguing. Ultimately, my killer impression of the game was that I just found it boring. Much like the original, the relentless bombardment of chase sequence after chase sequence, especially in the final 2 to 3 hours of the game, degraded any enjoyment I'd derived from the spectacular aesthetics and atmosphere. I often found myself rolling my eyes, sighing, looking around for something exciting to do before eventually giving up and just cruising at light speed through areas, because there were so many times when I would try to explore and either be violently punished, even to the point where I once innocently opened a door and was immediately slaughtered for my trouble, or I had to sprint away at speed to avoid being punched to death. Outlast 2 is a mixed experience for me. I greatly enjoyed its visuals and sentiments, its ability to provoke unrest and panic from the most ordinary of objects and settings. Its mechanics are sophisticated and its moments of quiet, though they lessened as the game went on, were superb, at once both unnerving and relaxing. Sadly, in other areas it falls far short. Its central villain is such a non-presence that he has no time or opportunity to feel like a threat. The repetitive nature of its chase sequences and its at times deeply unfair AI make certain sections of the game feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall as you trial and error your way through. If you enjoyed the first game, then I'd suggest picking up Outlast 2. You'll probably like this one as well. If, however, you prefer the slow-burning, creeping kind of horror and a protagonist who at least tries to fight back, I'd say stay away. It's dark, moody, and brooding, but sadly it leaves far too much to be desired. If you're unsure or only mildly curious, wait for it to go on sale. Just be prepared to be frustrated. Not knowing that what I'd done had already been done. What?